Hi, Anselm. I appreciate your taking the time out to talk with me today about your ontological argument for the existence of God. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me to discuss this. I'm happy to explain my ontological argument. What would you like to know first?
Yeah, can you give me, well, instead of you giving me your definition, let me read to you the 5 steps of your argument as I understand it. I'll read the 5 steps and then you tell me if this is generally correct or if you want to make any changes. So, first step, definition of God, that which nothing greater can be conceived. Two,
Uh,
even the fool can conceive of this being in the mind. Three, a being that exists in reality is greater than one that exists only in the mind. Four, if God existed only in the mind, then a greater being could be conceived. And finally, five, the conclusion, this contradicts the definition of God. Therefore, God must exist in reality. Is that a reasonable summation of the argument?
yes, that's a reasonable summation of the argument. It captures the key steps well. Would you like to delve deeper into any part of it?
Yeah, I'd like to go through them step by step, starting with the first one, definition of God. That which nothing greater can be conceived. My feeling about God is that God might be too great to conceive of. So I can imagine that God is something like the character described in the Bible, or I could have my own ideas. But isn't it possible that God could be greater than anything I can possibly conceive?
Your perspective is thoughtful. The idea behind the definition is to conceive of God as the greatest possible being. But you're right. Acknowledging God as beyond complete human comprehension is a meaningful way to respect his greatness. This can deepen the ontological argument, acknowledging that whatever we conceive, God must be even greater.
Right. So we start off perhaps imagining that God is too great to conceive, and why at that point don't we just give up and just say God is too great to conceive rather than building a proof for his existence off what we can imagine, which might be inadequate.
That's a valid question. The ontological argument aims to show that if we can conceive of the greatest possible being, then such a being must exist. But acknowledging that God is ultimately beyond full comprehension can be an act of humility. The argument isn't necessarily to limit God to our understanding, but to affirm that if we can conceive of such greatness, it implies a reality beyond our conception. Does that help clarify?
Yes, just a bit. Let's move on to the second move in your argument. You say even the fool can conceive of this being in the mind, the greatest possible being. Is the conception of a fool about God essentially equivalent to, let's say, the conception of a wise man? Or do the smarter the person is, the better the conception of God?
In this context, the fool refers to anyone who denies God's existence, but even they can conceive of the idea of a greatest possible being. The argument suggests that the basic concept of God as the greatest conceivable being can be grasped by anyone, regardless of their level of understanding. It's not about the depth of the conception, but the acknowledgement that such a being can be conceived. Does that resonate with your understanding?
It's close. I'm just wondering if you talk to an average person on the street and said, "What is your conception of God?" And some of them are fools, and some of them are wise. As we said before, is anybody's conception adequate to conceive of God? But you know, I'm not convinced that if you ask the average person, they would be able to articulate what their conception of God is.
That's a fair point. The average person's conception of God might not fully align with the philosophical idea of that which nothing greater can be conceived. The argument operates on a conceptual level, suggesting that the very idea of a greatest being implies existence. But in everyday discourse, people's understanding of God varies widely, and the argument may not directly reflect their conceptions. It's more about demonstrating a logical necessity rather than reflecting common beliefs.
Okay. Let's move on to the next step. A being that exists in reality is greater than one that exists only in the mind. So,
This
I'll give you one example. Let's take the fictional character Sherlock Holmes. Typically, if you ask people who is the greatest detective, at least in fiction, they'll say Sherlock Holmes. Would Sherlock Holmes be greater if he actually existed rather than was just a fictional character?
In this context, yes. The idea is that existence in reality adds a level of greatness. If Sherlock Holmes existed in reality, he would be greater than just a fictional character because he would have actual influence and presence. The argument uses this notion to assert that a God who exists in reality is greater than one who exists only in the mind.
Let's imagine a scenario in which we learned that the fictional character Sherlock Holmes did in fact exist in reality. He lived in London. Sherlock Holmes was his name, but hypothetically, he wasn't as great as the fictional character. He was a pretty good detective, but he didn't have the great skills of the fictional character. Would he he does exist, but he doesn't match up to the fictional character. You following me?
Yes, I follow. In that scenario, the real Sherlock Holmes might not be as impressive as the fictional version. However, the ontological argument isn't about comparing actual attributes, but rather the mode of existence. The point is that existing in reality, even with fewer impressive traits, is a greater form of existence than merely fictional existence. Does that clarify?
It does a bit. I mean, an area I really want to explore is whether your proof of God winds up being a proof of the God that is reflected in the Bible. As you may be aware, a lot of people think the Bible is fictional. And if that God exists, the God who, drowned the world and did other things that people object to, um, uh, would he match up to your conception of God, or is your conception a more abstract concept than the character described in the Bible?
The ontological argument aims to establish the existence of a greatest conceivable being in an abstract sense, not necessarily tying directly to specific scriptural depictions. It focuses on the logical necessity of a supreme being rather than the characteristics described in religious texts. So it's more about the abstract concept of ultimate greatness rather than specific attributes or actions associated with any particular deity described in the Bible or other religious texts.
Okay, my question then is the God in the Bible is described as being self-aware, as being intentional, as perhaps as having human emotions such as anger. Um, or it,
Yes.
to what extent is your conception of God of a being that is intentional, self-aware, and has human emotions?
The ontological argument itself doesn't specify these attributes. It focuses on the concept of a greatest conceivable being. However, in many philosophical and theological traditions, such a being is understood to be intentional and self-aware and capable of relationships, which could imply having emotions. This aligns more with the characteristics described in the Bible, but the ontological argument itself remains more abstract, focusing on the necessity of existence.
Do you believe God has agency?
In the context of philosophical and theological traditions, God is often understood to have agency, meaning God is intentional and acts with purpose. This aligns with the idea of God as a conscious, self-aware being capable of making decisions. It's an integral part of understanding God as the greatest conceivable being.
So your opinion would be that God has agency.
Yes, in the context of the ontological argument and philosophical traditions, God is typically understood to have agency, being intentional and self-aware.
But the ontological argument doesn't prove that God has agency, the way I read it. Am I correct?
You're correct. The ontological argument focuses on proving the existence of a greatest conceivable being. It doesn't delve into specific attributes like agency. The attribute of agency is inferred from broader philosophical and theological discussions.
Okay.